And welcome to another video. In this one, I'll be updating the Bakhmut front, where I will be doing the territorial changes that happened over the past day, as well as giving you a better insight on what's actually happening around Bakhmut right now and what the current situation is, as well as what different sources are saying about it. So starting out, we have the front line where the Russian forces are actually attacking on the whole front line. Over the past night, the Wagner PMC managed to capture the rest of the Vasilivka. I had previously reported that it was taken, but it was later revealed that it was contested, and now it has been taken. And I am assuming that this, for now, that it is this time completely taken, as both Syriac maps as well as Brasimv. And Brasimv is the war reporter who has close ties to Wagner themselves. So he's pretty accurate when it comes to what the Wagner process is. But essentially now the Russians have managed to capture this part, and if we look at the recap, it is here available here. And essentially with this, the Russian forces are now closer to attacking. This actually allows the Russian forces to now attack Bohdanivka from the north, as they both have the high grounds to the south of the Vasilivka and also the village itself, which frees up enough troops for them to advance southwards towards Bohdanivka. And with the current Russian advances here to the west, they are now closer to actually taking Bohdanivka, and they are now closer to reaching Bohdanivka and attacking the village, as well as the road south of the village that goes between Bakhmut and Jazov Yar. And now that we're talking about that road, there is this video here that shows the current situation in that road. There are multiple armored vehicles, which are of the Ukrainian army, that are destroyed or stuck within the mud. And the Ukrainian forces are also trying to move through this road. This is the road I was talking about. And they're trying to move through this road with the armored vehicles, as well as all of these soldiers. You can see there's a lot of Ukrainian soldiers. These all have yellow patches, and there are a lot of interesting things about the patches. So I'll be making a video on that later on, where I'll be explaining in depth exactly what those patches mean, based on the open source intelligence that is available. But essentially now we see that the Ukrainian forces are either moving in or out of the city. I'm not sure exactly if they're moving in or out, but we can see that they are moving through this road. Some vehicles get stuck, some don't, and there's a lot of artillery within the road. I see that there's none currently. I'm not sure why. There's sometimes this and sometimes isn't. It could be that the Wagnerians are focusing their artillery fire elsewhere, where they are trying to advance on other parts of the front line. But essentially this road is the only one. Let me highlight it. This road is the only one in and out of Bakhmut, and it is very muddy, as we saw in the picture. There's also pools of water. And looking at the weather, there's a bit of sun, but the next 3 days will be filled with rain. So the road will continue being muddy, and it will be difficult for the Ukrainians to go in and out of the city. But it will also be difficult for the Wagnerians to advance here to the north of the road, preventing them from actually cutting it off. Now moving on to the south of the city, we see that the Russian forces are attacking towards the hills here to the southwest of Ivanivsk. And they're also attacking here in this forest patch to the southwest of the city. And finally, they're also attacking to the southeast of the city in this open field. And we can see that there's some sort of road network here, which allows the Wagnerians to advance and connect the supplies within these roads, rather than the northern area where there isn't a lot of roads, which prevents the Ukrainians from properly supplying. As we can see, these roads aren't actually paved. They are just dirt roads that have been evened out, which allows the Ukrainians to use them, but they are still very difficult to traverse through, while these are actually paved roads. As for the south of the city itself, the Russian forces are attacking here to the southwest in the residential area that is here, similar to the dacha areas in the Vuhledar sector. And then to the south of the city itself, here we see that the Russian forces have reached the residential area and are fighting within the city itself in the southwestern area. And they're also attacking here to the east of the cemetery, and most likely also at the cemetery, where they are trying to gain control over this area and are trying to advance further northwards. As for the eastern part of the city, the Russian forces, after capturing the whole eastern bank of the Bakhmutka River, the Russian forces are now attacking northwards from the western bank as well as across the bank. They are trying to actually attack the Ukrainian positions across the river line, which will allow the Russian forces to essentially pin down the Ukrainian forces, as the ones attacking from the south will have an easier time advancing, and it will allow them to connect them from the two sides, which will essentially allow the Russian forces to gain a strategic advantage when it comes to the fighting on a small scale. As for the north of the city, fighting continues across the river lines here as well, as the Russian forces are trying to pin down the Ukrainian forces and essentially prevent them from moving properly across the city line, and attempting to inflict as many casualties as possible while staying at a distance. While there are some stormtroopers here to the south of the city, there's essentially only a lot of shelling to the north, which means that the main soldiers that are actually storming the city are in the south, while all the forces to the northeast and northwest of the city aren't actually engaging within the city lines now. And this brings me to the next video, where a Ukrainian colonel general is talking to some of the soldiers fighting within Bakhmut. That means he actually went to Bakhmut physically to be there and encourage his soldiers. So this is actually a good morale boost for the soldiers defending the city. And that is very important because Zelensky announced that Ukraine needs to hold the city at all costs. Which brings me to this article here. So the article I chose for this video is this one. NATO chief: Russian forces may take Bakhmut in the coming days. By using ground news, I was able to find the latest and most relevant news around Bakhmut by searching on the topic. I then found an article with a headline that caught my eyes. I then was presented with a variety of information, of which there's news coverage details, where ground news presents me with 51 different sources used in 34 different articles, of which 11 were leaning left, 11 were leaning right, and 12 were centrists. The article was last updated 13 hours ago, and here's a graph for the bias distribution that I mentioned earlier in the news coverage details. I then went down to filter exactly which news I wanted. So I went first to center because I want some centrist news articles. I then sorted by factuality as well as the latest articles, and I hit all paywall sources, which then brought me to this article by The Hill. So thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring this video and making my work easier. Go to ground.news/weeb, sign up for free, or subscribe for unlimited access. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg, who is the Secretary General of NATO Alliance, he says that over the past weeks and months, we have seen fierce fighting in and around Bakhmut, and what we see is that Russia is storming in more troops, more forces, and what Russia lacks in quality, they try to make up in quantity. This is obviously influenced by Western propaganda, where they essentially provide this narrative with that the Ukrainian soldiers are extremely more powerful than the Russian soldiers, and that the only way Russia is actually advancing is because they have the sheer numerical superiority, which actually makes no sense because Russians have only mobilized 300,000 troops since the start of the war, and with the 190,000 they started with, that's 500,000 soldiers. And then we have 150,000 soldiers who aren't even involved with the war yet, which brings it down to 340,000 Russian soldiers. Comparing that to Ukraine, who have mobilized multiple times and have a force estimated to be around 800,000 strong. Of course, these numbers could be inflated because these are only estimates, but there's no clear evidence as to the fact that Russia should have more troops than Ukraine. I would say that both quality and quantity of the troops themselves are somewhere close to each other, with no clear evidence as to one being better than the other, but the sheer quantity of equipment and the quality of equipment leans to the side of the Russians significantly, which is why we're seeing a Russian advance. At the same time, we're mainly seeing Wagner forces in Bakhmut, which means that the most forces fighting within that city is actually Wagner forces, which are the Russian prisoners that they have conscripted, as well as the professional soldiers they've hired throughout the years. So with this information, the Russians essentially have plenty of men to go around after the Battle of Bakhmut, where here they are providing this narrative and what they have earlier said, that the Russians are losing 5-1 what the Ukrainians are losing in the city, which makes no sense, as the Russians are claiming the Ukrainians have lost about 10,000 soldiers in Bakhmut in February, and a 5-to-1 loss ratio, which would mean that essentially all of Wagner would be gone by now if that was true. As I mentioned, they have suffered big losses, but at the same time, we cannot rule out that Bakhmut may eventually fall in the coming days. So this is very interesting because he already says in the coming days, and that is weird because the Ukrainians have already said that they want to stay and defend the city. As we see here near the bottom of the article, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed that his country continue to defend Bakhmut and told CNN's Wolf Blitzer in an interview airing Wednesday night that the city is tactical for Ukraine, where he then later mentions something around the idea that Bakhmut opens the floodgate for Russian soldiers to other cities in the Donbas region, where he then mentions the cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, which are these two very significant strongholds of the Ukrainian army, especially Sloviansk as it is the center of the Ukrainian defenses within the Donbas region. If the Russian forces manage to capture Sloviansk, Liman is essentially gone, as well as a breakthrough across the defensive line between Sloviansk and Konstantinivka, which will also allow the Russian forces to attack Izium, as well as complete control over the Donbas region, as they will be able to cut off all supply lines across the whole front. Also, it is important to note that the final defensive line of the Ukrainians in the Donbas region is the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line. Why do I say this? It is because the Donbas region is a heavily industrialized region, which essentially means that all of the cities and villages within the Donbas region are all mines as well as industrial zones. However, this essentially stops by the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line. If this section of the Donbas region is the most fortified zone, then this western section is much less fortified, and this front here by the Donetsk region itself is heavily fortified. So essentially, taking control over the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line allows the Russian forces to enter this less industrialized zone, which is essentially completely flat lands with barely any industrial zones, and then they can outflank the Ukrainian positions by the fortified areas in the Donetsk front itself. So with this information, we can then see that the Russian forces are aiming at Sloviansk with this offensive. Taking Bakhmut will allow the Russian forces to take control over the highway that leads up to Sloviansk, cutting off Siversk and endangering Liman, while at the same time threatening Sloviansk straight ahead by gaining control over the highway. However, this is a long process as the Ukrainians have the high ground by the canal. As long as the Ukrainians prepare proper defenses by the canal, they will be able to slow down the Russians significantly. However, there is no significant settlements in this front. The only one is Chesev Yar, and it is significantly smaller than Bakhmut. Although it gains the advantage of the high ground, it is not able to have the same impact as Bakhmut had, as Bakhmut is heavily supplied. There's many roads going in and out of Bakhmut from both the south, north, west, and everywhere else. So the Ukrainians use this as a supply hub and the main defensive position of the front line. The Siversk-Bakhmut line was a very significant defensive line, as it was very well supplied and easily defended. However, now that the Russian forces have captured most supply routes in and out of the city, as well as this area, Siversk and Bakhmut are both significantly less supplied than what they used to be. And at the same time, looking at the Chesev Yar situation, just cutting off this road here to the south of the city will essentially completely cut off all supplies to Chesev Yar. So they only have one single supply route to defend, and the Russian forces can threaten it from two directions, both from the north and the south. The most significant defensive line is the canal itself, and that has already been breached to the south of the city, which essentially means that the Russian forces have already bypassed that significant defensive line. So the Ukrainians do not have that much significant advantages here. So we're seeing the NATO organization as well as Zelensky himself contradicting each other, where NATO and the West in general says Bakhmut is tactically and strategically insignificant, and Zelensky is saying that essentially the fall of Bakhmut leaves a floodgate for Russian soldiers towards the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line, essentially saying all defenses between these two positions will fall quickly. And which explanation am I more inclined to believe? I'm more inclined to believe Zelensky in this situation, as the Ukrainian forces have not set up any proper defenses by the canal. And at the same time, the Russian forces attacking on this part of the front line are mainly the Wagner units, which means that as soon as the Russian forces capture the city, the Sky News analyst says that the Russians usually hold an operational pause after capturing some significant areas, similar to what they did in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and so on. However, with this we see that there's the Wagnerians, but with this we see that it is mainly the Wagnerians who are fighting within the city, which means that even if they decide to hold an operational pause after capturing the city, the reserve Russian forces will still be able to continue their attacks, taking advantage of the breakthrough and allowing them to reach the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line. So essentially, a loss of Bakhmut is very significant for the Ukrainians, which is why they keep sending more and more troops. So this is why I'm more inclined to believe that this video that I showed earlier of Ukrainian soldiers on an armored vehicle moving through the road between Jazov and Bakhmut is most likely going to Bakhmut rather than from it, as the Ukrainian forces really want to defend the city at all costs. And that brings us to the final video, which is this one by Prosenf. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a war reporter, war correspondent with close ties to Wagner. So essentially he's here in Bakhmut with the Wagnerians, trying to see what is actually going on and looking at the residential area. I haven't been able to geolocate this area, so I am going to go up with what it is saying, and it is allegedly close to the city center of Bakhmut, which means that it is most likely here to the eastern bank of the Bakhmutka river, which means that it is most likely somewhere in this section here, as there are a bunch of high-rise buildings. So most likely in this section here, as I don't see any other areas in the eastern part of the Bakhmutka river, which has high-rise buildings. So essentially we're seeing the Russian forces taking control over the eastern bank of Bakhmutka river, storming the southern part of the city, while trying to advance westwards in the northwestern part, and at the same time attacking the Ukrainian positions in the south, preventing any soldiers or supplies going in and out of Bakhmut from the south. And that is the general situation in and around Bakhmut. That is going to be all for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.